So as people go to the mics, we'll start over there, and then we'll go there. But I'll ask sort of the first question. So this session was more about the guardrails that are in place. And I think, Jordan, you touched upon it some, but I would like you all to sort of touch upon it, is where are the gaps in the guardrails in affording, whether it's the regulatory gaps or the policy gaps, where are those gaps, and where should we be focusing some of our concerns around consumer genomics?
So if it's okay, I'll start. I think I kind of alluded to it before, is that there's a lot of patchwork of protections that are out there, and there's no single comprehensive level of protection. I think everyone's doing a great job trying to fill those holes, but I think some of those holes exist. I do really think that from the consumer's perspective, I don't know if the consumers are aware of these protections, and I really think it'd be hard for them to, again, navigate, to understand which protections actually apply to them. So I think there's both a gap in the protection itself, and I think there are gaps in the awareness of the protections.
So I'm not sure we're going to build a guardrail that protects privacy in this space. I think, you know, from the perspective of the healthcare setting, I think we're kind of putting Band-Aids on like a leg that needs to be amputated. So in some ways. So I think until we have sort of universal health care or things like that, I mean, we're really addressing the fundamental problem of like people are concerned about being discriminated against for health insurance. They're going to, you know, they're worried about being discriminated against in areas where we typically want to discriminate against people because it's a business and, you know, we have to make business decisions, that sort of thing. So I think that's one problem. I think there's always going to, as I said in my presentation, there's always going to be privacy risks. I don't think we can completely protect privacy. To me, it's about how do we do the best job that we can do, be as transparent as possible, and try to engage the public in a way that increases trust and doesn't completely undermine it. And to me, that's the ultimate goal.
So just a comment on consumer genomics. Increasingly, we're seeing a convergence between what, on the one hand, we call consumer versus healthcare. A number of the consumer-focused companies are increasing, as Jordan mentioned, partnering with the healthcare institutions. And so I think we do a disservice by trying to keep them separate, because ultimately a lot of the concerns we have apply regardless of who ordered the test and who's getting the results or who's getting them first. And I do think consensus about what's the most important aspect of this and how much risk tolerance we can and should accept is an important part of moving forward. You could have a system where nobody gets a test unless you've had 2 adequate and well-controlled clinical studies, and you absolutely know that variant's associated. By the time you get there, however, that the information is probably irrelevant or been overtaken by events. On the other hand, you could say, everybody pick your favorite publication and go with that. The reality is it's a messy process of validating this information. And there are differences of opinion about how much is enough. Given that, it's particularly important that consumers understand the limitations of what they're getting, and that part of that may be not overselling and making sure they know that a test does or doesn't mean the limits of what the test means. I'll leave it there.
Hi. Oops. Hi, Jameson Voss. I'm in the Air Force, as you might be able to tell, speaking on my own behalf this afternoon. Apologize, my voice is cracking. So I think that I just wanted to ask about the maybe somewhat of an assumption that the privacy interest, it has in mind discrimination as the concern for why privacy would wish to be retained. And it could be that that is a predominant interest that's driving privacy wishes. I just am not familiar with where people fall on that question. But I think that there could be other interests that are also valid. I think there could be association level interests. In other words, people have a freedom of association, or there may be associations that can be made that people wish to hold private. And I think that one of the key ones that I wanted to discuss was the legislation that wasn't brought up was the FIRMA legislation, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2018. This this was passed in the House by a margin of 400 to 2, so it was very overwhelming just recently. But the meaning of it is still, again, similar to some of the other regulations coming into view. There was a recent report in the New York Times in February saying that that there were a use case of genetic information in China that involved trying to identify individuals for purpose of long-term surveillance. And the extent to which that use case is occurring in China is maybe unclear, at least to me, or I don't know, just from the New York Times report. But as a result of that reporting, there were statements from the scientists that were involved in it, and there were also statements from one of the companies that the New York Times had indicated was involved in this particular use case, saying that they didn't wish to be associated with that particular use case. And I know that one of the discussions in the Forum for the Future of Privacy is the right for data deletion that could be available in the event that people are aware of associations from the company that they don't wish to participate in, and they wish to be private from certain types of use cases or certain types of associations. And so I think one of the goals of FIRMA is to allow consumers, or to allow the government perhaps, to be aware of foreign involvement, foreign investment, because Congress with FIRMA pushed this into the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to say that CFIUS should review whether or not genetic information being released would present a threat to national security when there are foreign investment or other foreign involvements in U.S. companies. And I think that there may be maybe two particular interests in privacy that would apply to consumers broadly about that. One would be, should consumers have an ongoing ability to request data deletion of their data? And secondly, should consumers have access to foreign involvement in the companies that they're associated with?
Yes. I mean, I would say yes to both of those.
I would agree.
Long question, short answer.
James from Helix. I was hoping to actually make one comment, maybe two disparate questions, actually. So thank you for bringing up the Future of Privacy Forum. Helix was one of the founding organizations with 23 and Ancestry to establish that best practices. And just to give a little bit of history there, this was started in kind of late 2017 when we were seeing the ramp in consumer samples now manifesting in many of these graphs. And I think it was very much a statement on our side that we wanted to do. One is differentiate between those entities that were self-regulating and those that would essentially be bad actors in the space. The second was we viewed much of what we think today as kind of the hybrid model of clinical testing inevitably going to be impacting consumers. And so as a standard-setting organization, to set some of those practices for those clinical organizations that would be considered interacting directly with consumers, this is one way we thought of promulgating that. And the third is, I think, just to reference the doc, my lens on it has been historically that genomic data is probably one of the first data sets that flows between clinical and recreational use. And inevitably, we will see other data sets do that. And so inevitably, all patients become consumers and vice versa. And so some of our lens on that has been that how do you set standards where this is the first example of other data that may be flowing back and forth over time. So just a little bit of a color as you potentially digest your 21-page doc when you're trying to sleep. Two disparate questions. I think the first one is, I would be interested to see if the panels care to speculate a bit on the need for specific language and privacy legislation regarding genetics. I.e., is the data sensitive enough that we should be looking for it in privacy legislation inevitably that will occur at the federal level, unless we let CCPA essentially become the law of the land. And the second question, more related to regulatory, is we've seen FDA kind of talk about IDEs in particular related to studies now. Historically, it was BabySeq, now more recently, all of us. Ostensibly, you could think of all of us as a million-person over-the-counter genomics experiment to some extent. But it does raise concerns about interference with large-scale research that's ostensibly held under NIH guidance and things like that historically. I'm just curious if you could speculate a little bit about FDA's role in that and whether or not they should be regulating in that space.
I'll take the second question because I know absolutely nothing about the first question. I'm not purporting that I know anything about the second one either, but at least I'm willing to try. So what you're alluding to is FDA has taken the position that if genetic sequencing is used as part of a clinical study, not to study the technology of the genetic testing itself or the sequencing itself, but as a tool to study something else, for example, longitudinal, the use of the data over time, that FDA has authority to regulate the sequencing under the assumption that, or under the authority FDA has to regulate investigational products. Having researched this and speaking for myself, I think legally that's a very problematic position that they've asserted. It's not how I read the regulations. But nevertheless, I acknowledge that that is how FDA currently is interpreting those regulations.
So the first question relates to should we have genetic exceptionalism? I mean, this is a long-standing debate about whether we should have special regulations that exceptionalize genetic information and provide higher protections for those. And we've seen it in other areas too, like HIV and things like that. I don't think we're going to resolve that today. I think there's good arguments on both sides. I do think that sort of the latest familial matching that we've seen raises some distinctive issues around genetic information that may not be apparent in most other types of information, although I'm sure somebody can come up with an example to debunk that. But I think a lot of people see, well, here's what I would say. I think there's the need to protect privacy and prevent discrimination more generally, and I think this was the best we could get done politically. So is that the right thing? I'm not sure I think it's the right thing, but I think it's the best we've got right now.
Thanks.
So yeah, just to expand on that, because I really liked your slide about the balance between privacy and innovation and research and all of that. And in a world of absolute privacy, none of that gets done. And I think we're all on the same page that we would like to see the knowledge base continue to grow. And even the consumers are interested in participating in that as well, or at least 80% of them. So, and again, this is just my own opinion on this, but I am hesitant to push forward something with genetic exceptionalism because I think it really just represents our current uncomfortableness with it, and I think eventually it'll go away. I think your example of HIV was perfect, right? It's not particularly protected anymore. It's because we got used to it, and it just became part of our world. I'm not unconvinced that this won't follow the same pathway. I think I did like triple negatives in that sentence.
So Greg Farrow, so first a note to self and planning committee, complex policy conversation should occur immediately after 2 cups of coffee in the morning as opposed to late afternoon. Next, 2 questions. One I think will be very quick and the next maybe a little bit longer. The first is the FDA letter regarding drug names in PGX reports. Did it pertain to drugs that had a PGX indication in the FDA labeling as well, or were they doing testing beyond what was in the FDA labeling, recommended in FDA, or discussed in the FDA? It isn't recommended for many drugs, but discussed. Do you know the answer?
It's a great question with not an entirely clear answer. So the safety communication basically just said labs or those offering tests should make sure that their results are consistent with what's in the label, which you could interpret to mean is in the label or is not, contradicted by the label. What FDA has said privately to a number of companies is don't say anything about drug names, period, end of story, whether they're in the label or not in the label.
And generic names.
Yes, correct. Not just brand names, but about, don't tie a genetic variant to a pharmaceutical in your test report.
Interesting. Okay. So the next question is, with any of the states that have additional protections beyond GINA, has it ever been tested as to whether that protection is portable? So let's say if an individual is tested a decade earlier in California, the results are returned to them in California. They're a resident of California, and a decade later they move away. Do any of those protections move with the patient? So I think that's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. Does that protection that's afforded by a state for testing done for a resident of that state return in that state?
So I don't know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask my lawyer friend. But I wonder. I mean, does it apply to insurers? And does it go with the person tested, or does it go with the companies that reside in that state? I would imagine it goes with the companies that reside in that state. So the employers and the whatever they're regulating that operate in that state are the ones that can't use the information.
But that would say that if you were tested in that state, let's say you were tested by 23andMe in California, a resident of California, you mean that the law wouldn't apply to an insurer that resides in Delaware if you were trying to buy insurance from a company in Delaware?
As your attorney, I would say it depends entirely on how the statute is written and who is the subject of the regulation. So who has the right? So not a clear or answer that's going to be one size fits all.
But I wonder if that isn't something that should be explored as an avenue to trying to think about affording additional protections if that is not forthcoming at the federal level.
Hi, I'm Dorothy. I'm a consumer, I guess is what my title is. I have a question about the third-party companies. How are they regulated? So if these are companies that are not doing the tests, if I was to take my DNA and give it to another company, what are the protections there?
Amy and I are arguing over who gets to answer this question.
We've written together on
Yes, we're. You invited me to write a paper with you on this. So is your question limited to the privacy information or generally who regulates those entities?
Well, I mean anything. Displaying my sort of ignorance of all of this, I didn't really think about these third-party companies very much before today, so I feel sort of alarmed by them. And I think when we're talking about the regulations, I feel confident the companies like 23andMe and some of these bigger companies are going to abide by those regulations. Some of these third-party companies, I don't even know where they're based out of or what they're doing, and it seems more and more of them are popping up. When you were listing the regulations, I sort of just kept thinking, well, where do they fall
fit?
Under those regulations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and again, answer is not as good as the question. It depends. So to the extent a company like that was, I sometimes call them dry lab activities. So they don't actually sequence, but they take the data and they interpret it to sort of effectuate the value of the data. New York State would say that they meet the definition of a laboratory. So to the extent they were operating in New York or on data from New York, in theory, at least, they would be subject to NYS CLEP. Whether that's enforced or not, I don't know. The other potential area of oversight, but we haven't necessarily seen it developed yet is to the extent they've developed software to do their interpretive practices. That software may or may not be subject to FDA regulation as a medical device. The 21st Century Cures Act, enacted in 2016, talked about types of software that are or are not subject to FDA regulation. I'm not aware of guidance really that specifically fleshes out requirements for that type of software. So it does fall potentially between cracks, or to the extent it is captured, it's not necessarily the subject of a lot of focus right now.
Interesting. Thank you.
All right, Jeff, our last question.
Yes, Jeff. So this morning we acknowledged the potential impact of consumer genomics on the family. And this afternoon, I believe what I heard was that consumer genomics companies or diagnostic companies writ large are not subject to HIPAA. If I understood what you guys said, right now doing cascade screening within a healthcare delivery system is very challenging because there's a lot of opportunity for HIPAA liability. But if it's true that the consumer genomics companies have more freedoms to contact family members, then potentially we can do more effective cascade screening through using that platform versus through a healthcare system. Can you help me understand whether the HIPAA makes it or the lack of HIPAA regulation of those companies makes it easier to do cascade screening?
So just a clarifying question, are you saying when the consumer genetic testing companies engage with a health system?
No, I'm talking about just
By themselves?
yeah.
So, I mean, in that setting, they are not covered entities, and they would not be held under those requirements of privacy. I know you had wanted to say something, or were you asking me about?
They may still have confidentiality and privacy rules that they, adhere to that are not HIPAA related. But HIPAA wouldn't apply to them. But remember that, I don't know, are you talking about doing family file or communicating with family members without the knowledge or consent of the individual?
Yes, because that's where providers, are blocked right now with HIPAA to be able to say, I want to contact family members of a proband and then begin to do the cascade testing. That can be done through letters and all kinds of workarounds, but it's largely inefficient.
I would imagine that would largely reside in the terms and conditions that we probably all just click through.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Just a quick note that one area where the Federal Trade Commission has been somewhat active is in investigating genetic DTC companies is with respect to privacy violations. So even without HIPAA, there are some other sources of privacy protections, and at a minimum, if you publish a privacy policy, as I think most, if not all of these companies have, and you are behaving in a manner inconsistent with your privacy policy, that would be an unfair trade practice, and FTC in a few cases has looked into that.
Great, thank you for our speakers and everybody, and the great, awesome discussion we've had. Thanks.